During the Vietnam War, American forces faced an enemy that was extraordinarily difficult to identify. The Viet Cong did not rely solely upon guerrillas carrying weapons through the jungles of South Vietnam. Behind those fighters existed another organization, an underground network of political cadres, intelligence officers, recruiters, couriers, tax collectors, and local officials operated within the South Vietnamese society. They lived openly among the civilian population. They gathered intelligence, they recruited soldiers, they collected taxes, they arranged supplies, and perhaps most importantly, they maintained an underground communist administration that could survive even when Viet Cong military units were driven from an area. The United States called this network the Viet Cong Infrastructure, or VCI. And in 1967, the Americans began coordinating an ambitious intelligence program intended to identify and dismantle it. Its name was Phoenix. What followed would become one of the most controversial intelligence operations of the entire Vietnam War. By the middle of the 1960s, American commanders had recognized a fundamental problem with their strategy in Vietnam. American forces could defeat Viet Cong formations in conventional engagements. They could destroy base camps, seize weapons, and inflict enormous casualties. But military success did not necessarily translate into political control. An American or South Vietnamese unit might enter a district, drive out the guerrillas, and then leave. Yet hidden within the population could remain communist political organizers who maintained contact with the Viet Cong. These cadres formed what was now identified as the Viet Cong Infrastructure. The VCI operated at several levels. There were communist officials at regional, provincial, district, village, and hamlet level. Their responsibilities could include intelligence gathering, recruitment, propaganda, finance, logistics, and political organization. Some coordinated guerrilla activity. Others performed functions that resembled those of a clandestine government. Consequently, the United States increasingly concluded that defeating the Viet Cong required more than destroying its military formations. The underground political organization also had to be attacked. Phoenix emerged from that requirement. There is an important distinction that is frequently overlooked when discussing the Phoenix program. Phoenix was the name given to the American advisory and coordination effort. The South Vietnamese counterpart was known as Phung Hoang. The purpose of the system was to bring together intelligence that had previously been scattered among numerous organizations. South Vietnam possessed police intelligence. The army had intelligence. Provincial authorities had intelligence. American military units collected intelligence. The CIA maintained its own sources. Defectors supplied information. Captured documents produced further information. The problem was that these organizations did not always communicate effectively with one another. Phoenix attempted to create a system in which that information could be assembled, compared, and converted into operations. The American side of the program became part of Civil Operations and Revolutionary Development Support, CORDS. CORDS itself operated within the structure of the US Military Assistance Command Vietnam, or MACV. This produced an unusual organization. Phoenix involved soldiers, intelligence officers, civilians, police and paramilitary forces, but it was not itself a conventional combat formation. There was no Phoenix Division. There was no Phoenix battalions. Instead, Phoenix provided a framework through which existing organizations could coordinate their efforts against the Viet Cong infrastructure. At national level, American support for Phoenix ultimately came through MACV and CORDS. A Phoenix committee established policy for American support to the program. Beneath it was a Phoenix directorate within CORDS. The directorate consisted of a director, normally a senior civilian, a military deputy director, and staff elements dealing with areas including plans and operations, training, and program administration. Its responsibilities included providing operational guidance, administrating the program, supporting field activities and coordinating American assistance to the South Vietnamese Phung Hoang organization. But the system became particularly important below Saigon. Phoenix organization extended downward through regional, provincial and district levels. On the South Vietnamese side, Phung Hoang committees brought together representatives from organizations including national police, special police, military intelligence and security organizations, regional and popular forces, and the Chu Hoi defector program, plus other government agencies. At province and district level, intelligence coordination centres became crucial. They were generally known as Province Intelligence and Operations Coordination Centres, or PIOCCs, and District Intelligence and Operations Coordination Centres, DIOCCs. Their purpose was relatively straightforward. Bring the available intelligence on the Viet Cong infrastructure into one location. Identify individuals, establish their positions within the communist organization, develop intelligence files, determine priorities, and then pass usable intelligence to an organization capable of acting upon it. This is an important distinction. A DIOCC was not normally a headquarters commanding its own battalion of troops. It was primarily an intelligence and operations coordination centre. If intelligence indicated that a particular Viet Cong district official was operating in a village, the centre could help coordinate the organisation best suited to apprehend them. That might be the national police, it might involve regional or popular forces, it might involve regular South Vietnamese troops, or in particularly important cases, the mission might be given to one of the most controversial organisations associated with Phoenix, the Provincial Reconnaissance Units. The Provincial Reconnaissance Units, usually known simply as the PRUs, became one of the principal direct action forces associated with the campaign against the Viet Cong Infrastructure. They were South Vietnamese paramilitary formations rather than American units. Their personnel were recruited locally and their composition varied considerably from province to province. Among their ranks could be former members of the South Vietnamese Armed Forces. Some were veterans of Vietnamese Special Forces. Some had previously served with the Civilian Irregular Defence Group, or CIDG. Perhaps most valuable were former Viet Cong personnel. A former Viet Cong member could possess something an American soldier newly arrived in Vietnam could never easily acquire: local knowledge. He might understand the organisation of the Viet Cong. He could recognise names. He might know routes, safe houses and meeting places. And he understood the environment in which the underground organisation operated. Other PRU personnel were simply local recruits who preferred serving within their own home province rather than entering the regular South Vietnamese army. PRU teams were relatively small. A typical operational team might contain approximately 15 to 20 men. Their size allowed them to conduct targeted operations very different from the large American search and destroy missions usually associated with the Vietnam War. Their objective might not be to locate an enemy battalion. It could instead be just to locate one single man. Although the PRUs were Vietnamese, American personnel played an important advisory and support role. The CIA originally played a central part in organising, funding and administering the PRU program. But there were not enough CIA paramilitary officers available to place agency personnel alongside every unit. Consequently, American military personnel were also assigned as advisors. These advisors could include men with backgrounds in some of the most highly trained formations in the United States Armed Forces. Personnel associated with the PRU advisory effort included members drawn from or experienced in organizations such as the U.S. Army Special Forces, U.S. Navy SEALs, and the U.S. Marine Reconnaissance Units. These were particularly suitable personnel. Special Forces soldiers already possessed extensive experience working with indigenous forces. SEALs were accustomed to small unit operations in the waterways and difficult terrain of South Vietnam. Marine reconnaissance and personnel brought experience in surveillance, patrolling and small unit combat. By late 1969, the PRU program numbered roughly 4,000 Vietnamese personnel. A contemporary US government document recorded that the force has been supported by approximately 101 American military advisors and 7 CIA personnel. The CIA continued to fund the PRU program and retained overall American administrative control. This produced a distinctive relationship. The American advisor was not necessarily commanding the Vietnamese unit in the conventional sense. The PRUs remained Vietnamese organizations. American personnel provided advice, intelligence assistance, communications, logistics, and access to American resources. The Vietnamese personnel provided something equally important: knowledge of local population, language, terrain, and enemy. To understand how these operations worked in practice, we can examine a documented Provincial Reconnaissance Unit mission conducted in Binh Dinh province on the 8th of September 1969. The operation took place near Phu Cat, an area in which Viet Cong guerrillas continue to operate among rural communities. The South Vietnamese Provincial Reconnaissance Unit involved in the operation was accompanied by Warrant Officer Class 1 E.B. Ozzy Ostara, a member of the Australian Army Training Team Vietnam. And unlike many Phoenix-related operations whose details remain obscure, this particular mission was photographed. It provides an unusually detailed glimpse of what a PRU operation actually looked like. The operation did not begin with a conventional military patrol searching randomly for enemy forces. It began with intelligence. Information had been received indicating that the Viet Cong guerrillas were operating from a hamlet in the Phu Cat area. According to the intelligence, the guerrillas had been entering the local community and demanding food from villagers. This was precisely the type of situation in which the Provincial Reconnaissance Units were intended to operate. Rather than deploying a large conventional force, the PRU could use local intelligence to isolate a relatively small number of Viet Cong personnel. The objective was not to seize territory. It was to locate specific individuals. Acting on the information, the PRU moved into the area and established a cordon and search operation around the hamlet. The search began, and very quickly the intelligence proved accurate. As PRU scouts searched the area, they encountered Viet Cong personnel. One of the guerrillas threw a grenade at the advancing PRU scouts. He and another Viet Cong then attempted to escape into the jungle surrounding the hamlet. The PRU immediately pursued them, and both men were eventually caught. This was important as the capture of a Viet Cong guerrilla could potentially be considerably more valuable than simply killing him. A prisoner could be questioned. He might identify other members of his organization. He might reveal where they're hiding. And that information could immediately be used to continue the operation. That appears to be what happened at Phu Cat. The captured guerrillas helped lead the PRU deeper into the jungle. Approximately 1,500 meters from the hamlet, the search reached a concealed position where the 3 Viet Cong guerrillas had been living. The PRU had moved from general intelligence about the enemy activity to prisoners, and from those prisoners to a specific enemy hide. It was exactly the intelligence-driven process upon which the operations against the Viet Cong underground depended. The PRU scouts now surrounded the concealed position. At least one Viet Cong guerrilla remained inside. Photographs taken during the operation show a captured Viet Cong prisoner standing with PRU scouts in front of the hide. Seconds after one of those photographs was taken, the situation changed dramatically. The Viet Cong guerrilla inside the position opened fire. He also began throwing grenades. He refused to surrender. The PRU attempted to force him out of the bunker, and a grenade was eventually thrown into the position. The firefight illustrates an important point about the Provincial Reconnaissance Units. Although intelligence gathering and capture were central to their mission, these were still armed paramilitary operations. A mission intended to apprehend a suspected Viet Cong operative could turn into a close-range firefight within seconds. And this was one reason the PRUs were staffed and advised by personnel experienced in small unit operations. At least 2 Viet Cong personnel were captured during the operation. One of the prisoners was subsequently photographed alongside Jimmy Sin, an interpreter working with the Provincial Reconnaissance Unit. The prisoner reportedly indicated that he wanted to leave the Viet Cong and enter the South Vietnamese government's Chu Hoi, or open arms program. This was another important part of the wider counterinsurgency campaign. The objective was not necessarily to kill every member of the Viet Cong. Defection could be considerably more valuable. A former Viet Cong guerrilla could provide intelligence concerning his unit, commanders, supply routes and political organisation. And defectors could sometimes be used to identify other members of the communist underground. The intelligence cycle could therefore continue. But the operation was not yet finished. During the search, the PRU discovered something potentially far more dangerous. Near the position where the Viet Cong had been hiding, the scouts found electrical cable and a battery. The implication was immediately apparent. The Viet Cong had prepared a command-detonated mine. The PRU followed the cable. It extended for approximately 150 metres. At the end of it, they discovered an artillery shell buried beneath a dirt road. The shell had been converted into an improvised explosive device. Had a South Vietnamese or Allied vehicle travelled along the road, a Viet Cong observer could potentially have detonated the weapon remotely. What had begun as intelligence concerning guerrillas demanding food from villagers had therefore uncovered not simply a Viet Cong personnel, but also a prepared ambush weapon. The Phu Cat operation provides a useful illustration of the way a provincial reconnaissance unit could operate. The sequence is important. Intelligence identified enemy activity. A PRU was sent to investigate. A search operation identified VC in the area, which led to 2 being captured and 1 killed. New intel as a result of the capture led to an expanded search area, which in turn led to the discovery and disarming of an IED. This was counterinsurgency conducted at an extraordinarily local level. A conventional American infantry battalion might be concerned with destroying an enemy regiment or securing a large area. The PRU was operating on an entirely different scale. Its battlefield might consist of a single hamlet. Its initial intelligence might come from a single villager or informant. Its targets might consist of only 3 or 4 men. But those individuals could provide access to something considerably larger. Every captured guerrilla represented a potential source of intelligence. Every document could contain another name. Every name could lead to another hideout. And every hideout could reveal another part of the Viet Cong network. This was the fundamental logic behind the Provincial Reconnaissance Units. Find the individual, capture him if possible, exploit the intelligence, and use that intelligence to find the next target. There is, however, an important qualification. This particular operation should not be presented as a stereotypical Phoenix assassination mission. The historical evidence describes it as a PRU cordon and search operation against Viet Cong guerrillas based upon intelligence concerning their activities around the hamlet. Its value is that it demonstrates the methods and personnel of a genuine provincial reconnaissance unit in the field. It also illustrates something frequently lost in descriptions of Phoenix. PRUs did not simply arrive with lists of names and execute suspected communist officials. Their operations could involve surveillance, searches, pursuit, capture, interrogation, firefights and exploitation of newly discovered intelligence. And operations could evolve rapidly. At Phu Cat, information concerning guerrillas taking food from villagers eventually resulted in prisoners being taken, an enemy hideout being discovered, and a concealed command-detonated mine being located. It was a small operation, but it provides a remarkably clear example of how the intelligence war in Vietnam could work at ground level. And multiplied across dozens of provinces and hundreds of districts, operations such as this formed a part of a much larger effort to dismantle the Viet Cong's underground organisation. This leads to the most controversial question surrounding Phoenix. Was it an assassination program? The answer is more complicated than either description sometimes suggests. Officially, the objective was to neutralize members of the Viet Cong infrastructure. Neutralization could mean 3 things. A suspect could be captured. He could rally, meaning defect to the South Vietnamese government, or he could be killed. Capture was frequently preferred because prisoners represented potential intelligence sources. But PRU operations were armed operations conducted against members of an underground organisation operating in a war zone. Firefights occurred. Suspects resisted arrest. PRUs encountered armed Viet Cong units, and people were killed. Furthermore, the decentralised nature of the system created serious opportunities for abuse. Phoenix depended upon intelligence. This was simultaneously its greatest strength and its greatest weakness. The Viet Cong infrastructure did not normally wear uniforms. A district political cadre might appear to be an ordinary civilian. Identifying him therefore depended upon informants, captured documents, defectors, interrogation and surveillance. And that raised a fundamental question. What happened when the intelligence was wrong? Vietnamese society had its own local rivalries. Families feuded. Officials could be corrupt. Informants could have personal motives. An accusation of Viet Cong membership could therefore have devastating consequences. There were also serious abuses within the South Vietnamese detention and interrogation system. Torture was used in some of the interrogation centres. Prisoners could be subject to brutal treatment. And critics argued that Phoenix's emphasis on neutralisation encouraged arbitrary detention and extrajudicial killing. These accusations eventually reached the United States Congress. Phoenix became increasingly controversial. To its defenders, it was an intelligence coordination program aimed at dismantling the clandestine organisation that played a central role in communist warfare. To its critics, it became a system in which poorly verified intelligence could place individuals on target lists and expose them to arrest, torture or death. Both aspects are essential to understanding the program. Between 1968 and the early 1970s, official statistics credited the Phoenix and the Phung Hoang system with the neutralization of tens of thousands of suspected members of the Viet Cong infrastructure. Approximately 81,000 individuals were ultimately recorded as neutralized. Of these, roughly 26,000 were captured, more than 20,000 rallied or defected, and approximately 26,000 were recorded as killed. But those figures require considerable caution. The figures for those killed does not mean that Phoenix assassination teams executed 26,000 people. Individuals identified as members of the VCI who were killed during conventional military operations could also enter the Phoenix statistics. Consequently, the frequently repeated description of Phoenix as a program that assassinated 26,000 people is misleading. At the same time, it would be equally misleading to suggest that targeted lethal operations did not occur. They did. The historical argument concerns their scale, circumstances, and relationship to the broader Phoenix system. Assessing Phoenix is difficult because it operated alongside enormous changes in the war. The Tet Offensive of 1968 inflicted severe losses upon the Viet Cong. South Vietnamese security forces expanded. Pacification programs improved government control in many areas. And American and South Vietnamese military pressure continued. Phoenix formed one part of this much larger effort. Nevertheless, there is substantial evidence that the Viet Cong infrastructure was placed under increasing pressure. Experienced cadres were captured or killed, networks were penetrated, defectors provided intelligence, and the ability of the communist underground to operate freely in some areas was reduced. But there is a larger strategic problem. Even if Phoenix damaged the Viet Cong's clandestine organisation, it could not resolve the fundamental military struggle between North and South Vietnam. As American forces withdrew, the character of the conflict increasingly shifted. The final communist victory in 1975 was not achieved primarily by clandestine village cadres. It was achieved by conventional forces of the People's Army of Vietnam, supported by tanks, artillery and large-scale military formations. Phoenix had been designed principally to attack an underground political infrastructure. It was never designed to stop North Vietnamese armoured divisions advancing towards Saigon. The Phoenix program remains controversial because it occupied the uncomfortable territory between intelligence gathering, policing, counterinsurgency and warfare. It was not simply an assassination squad, nor was it merely an administrative intelligence program. It was a nationwide system intended to identify the hidden political structures supporting the Viet Cong and coordinate the organisations capable of attacking it. At the centre of that system were intelligence files and coordination centres. Around them operated police, soldiers, intelligence services and paramilitary forces. And among its most aggressive instruments were the Provincial Reconnaissance Units, locally recruited Vietnamese teams supported by CIA officers and American military advisors, including personnel with backgrounds in special forces, naval special warfare and marine reconnaissance. Phoenix demonstrated that the Vietnam War was being fought on two different battlefields. One was visible. Battalions, helicopters, artillery and aircraft fought for control of territory. The other was largely invisible. It was fought through informants, defectors, intelligence files, interrogation centres, political cadres and small teams moving into villages searching for individual members of a clandestine organisation. The United States could bring overwhelming firepower to the first battlefield. The Phoenix program was an attempt to find a way to fight on the second. And the methods employed in doing so ensured that Phoenix would remain controversial long after the Vietnam War itself had ended. If you enjoyed this video, hit like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.